The driver didn't even come to a full stop. The stagecoach just lurched, bucking like a wild horse before settling in a cloud of thick, choking dust. The door flew open and a woman, in a simple gray dress, was half pushed, half tossed onto the dry, packed earth of the road. Her satchel hit the ground first, a heavy, solid thud that seemed impossible for something so small. She stumbled, catching herself just an inch before her knees met the sharp gravel. "Bitter Creek," the driver grunted, not even bothering to look back. He flicked the reins. "You sure about this, miss?" But Leora didn't answer. She didn't have time. The door slammed shut with a crack, and the coach was gone, disappearing around a dusty bend before the grit had even settled on her shawl. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. The sun hung low and angry over the Montana hills, washing the town's tired storefronts in a pale, sickly gold. For a second, it looked almost kind, but that kindness vanished the moment people stepped into the light. Faces appeared in windows, peering from behind pristine lace curtains. A young boy on the street whispered something to his mother, and she yanked him back, pulling him quickly across the road as if Leora carried a plague. No one waved, no one nodded, no one even met her eye. It wasn't just caution, it was something else, something colder, something personal. Leora lifted her chin, a small act of defiance against the suffocating silence. She adjusted the worn shawl over her shoulders and took one step, then another, toward the squat silhouette of the general store. Her boots crunched on the gravel, each step sounding like a gunshot in the dead air. It felt like she was dragging the weight of a past they already knew, a life they had already judged. The bell above the store's door didn't jingle. It shrieked. Heat and dust followed her inside, but they were nothing compared to the silence that slammed into her. It was sharp, heavy, and aimed right at her. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set woman, her mouth drawn into a tight, unforgiving line. She didn't speak. She just stared. Not at Leora's eyes, but at her dress, her face, her left hand, which was bare. Then slowly, the woman leaned back, a cruel smirk twisting her lips. She spoke to the empty air, but her words were daggers meant for Leora. "Well, well," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Look what the goddamn wind dragged in. We don't want your kind here, not after what happened to the Barretts." Leora froze. Her blood ran cold. How could they know? How could they possibly know who she was, or why she'd come? A young man stocking jars in the corner shot her a look of pure pity, a quick, awkward nod before he practically fled into the back storeroom, unwilling to be a witness to whatever was about to happen. Leora's eyes darted to the dusty bulletin board. Tacked there by a single rusty pin was the reason she'd traveled 1,000 miles. A scrap of newspaper, folded and refolded until the creases were permanent. Barrett Ranch. Help wanted. Cook, cleaner, room included. No references needed. She stared at it, the words blurring, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to steady herself, to force the air back into her lungs. "I'm here," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "About the job." The woman behind the counter let out a sound that was half laugh, half choke. "The Barrett job? You want to work for Silas Barrett? Out at that cursed place?" She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into hateful slits. "He don't talk, don't smile, and he sure as hell don't pay much." Leora didn't flinch. "He still needs someone, doesn't he? You from around here?" The woman pressed. "No." "Got any kin in these parts?" "No." The woman's smirk returned, sharper this time. "You come all this way with no name and no past to scrub a dead man's dishes? What are you running from, girl?" Leora held her stare, her own gaze turning to ice. Dead men don't put out job postings. That quieted the room. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the buzzing of a fly against a dirty window pane. Then the front door creaked open again. A tall, wiry man with wind-burned skin and tired eyes stepped inside, brushing trail dust from his hat. He looked from the store owner to Leora, his expression unreadable. "Miss Hensley?" he asked, his voice like gravel and old tobacco. Leora's heart skipped a beat. Hensley. It was her mother's maiden name, a name she hadn't used in years, a name no one in this part of the country should know. "I'm Hank," the man said, seemingly unaware of her shock. "I work for Mr. Barrett. The wagon's out back." Leora could feel the store owner's eyes burning into her back as she turned. She picked up her heavy satchel, the secret inside it feeling like a ton of lead, and followed Hank out the back door without another word. The town of Bitter Creek seemed to hold its breath as she left, a collective, silent curse following her down the path. This wasn't just a town that disliked strangers. This was a town that was waiting for a war, and Leora had a terrifying feeling she had just walked onto the battlefield. The wagon ride was long and silent. The wheels creaked a mournful rhythm against the rutted road, a scar winding its way out of Bitter Creek and into the vast, empty loneliness of the Montana landscape. Leora sat stiff as a board, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Hank, the ranch hand, didn't speak. He just kept his eyes on the road ahead, his face a mask of weary resignation. They passed 3 homesteads, each one a lonely island in a sea of wheat-colored fields and sun-bleached fences. And at every one, she saw them. Eyes behind the curtains, watching her pass, judging, waiting. It was a suffocating feeling, like the whole county was a single giant room, and everyone had stopped talking the moment she'd walked in. "How many hands work the ranch now?" Leora asked, her voice quiet, just to break the oppressive silence. Hank didn't look at her. "Used to be 10, he said, his voice flat. "Back when Mrs. Barrett was alive." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Now it's just me, a stable boy, and the boss." Leora nodded once, pressing her fingers together. The name again, Mrs. Barrett, Elizabeth, her sister, the reason she was here, the reason for the weight in her satchel and the fear in her heart. "You ever cook for men before?" Hank asked, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Yes," she said simply. "You know how to boil potatoes and stay quiet?" "Yes." He finally glanced at her then, just for a second. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften, just a fraction. A flicker of something that might have been sympathy, or maybe just shared sorrow, passed through his eyes. "You'll be fine," he said, though it sounded more like a warning than a reassurance. The Barrett Ranch appeared on the horizon like a ghost. It was vast, yes, but it was a hollow vastness. The main house was large, a 2-story shadow against the dying sun, but it looked empty. The shutters were all closed tight, like eyelids sealed against the light. Weeds, thick and thorny, curled up the porch steps, choking the life out of the wood. A nearby windmill turned in the slow, hot breeze, its lazy circles accompanied by a creaking sound like old, dry bones grinding together. The wagon rolled to a stop. The silence that fell was absolute. Hank climbed down, his boots landing softly in the dust. Leora followed, her legs stiff, her heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This was it, the place where her sister had lived, the place where she had died. Then, a door opened. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was not what she expected. Silas Barrett had the broad-shouldered frame of a man who had once commanded respect, a man used to hard work and open spaces. But it was all muted now, dulled like rusted iron. His hair was graying at the temples, his face shadowed by several days of stubble. He didn't smile, he didn't nod. He just looked at her, his eyes empty, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Or maybe, as if he wished she wasn't. "This her?" he asked Hank, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that hadn't been used for conversation in a long, long time. "This is Miss Hensley," Hank said, tipping his hat. Silas didn't say another word. He just stared at Leora for one more long, unnerving second. Then he turned, walked back into the house, and left the front door swinging open behind him. An invitation that felt more like a dare. Leora stood frozen, the wind pressing her gray skirt against her legs. The house before her wasn't warm. It wasn't welcoming. But it wasn't worse than the lies and the secrets she'd left behind. It was just empty. So she took a breath, hoisted her heavy satchel, and stepped over the threshold. The door creaked shut behind her, plunging the hallway into a dusty gloom. It smelled of dry wood, old secrets, and something long forgotten. But underneath the silence, she felt something else. A flicker. Not hope. Not yet. But something. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of a single breath, still clinging to the walls of this dead house. She followed the hallway into the kitchen. Her bag was already on the floor where Hank had left it. A cast-iron stove, cold as a tombstone, a chipped basin, an empty kettle. She set her hands on the counter. It felt like old bark, cracked and dry. Tomorrow she would boil water. Tonight she would sleep. But as her fingers traced the worn wood, they brushed against something. A deep gouge, not from a knife, but from something heavy being dragged. And next to it, almost invisible in the dim light, were 3 small, faint scratches. A child's markings, or a warning. She couldn't tell which. Somewhere in this dead house, a story was waiting to be told. And she was the only one who had come to listen. The silence of the Barrett house was a living thing. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence, thick and suffocating, filling every corner, every shadow. After Hank's footsteps faded from the porch, Leora stood in the kitchen for a long minute, just listening to it. No ticking clock, no clatter of pans. This was a place that had forgotten how to make a sound. It was a tomb. She finally exhaled, a small white cloud in the chilly air, and turned to the stove. Cold iron, empty kettle, a single lonely pot hanging from a hook. She opened the pantry door, and it groaned in protest. Inside, flour, salt, dried beans, and coffee grounds hardened into a solid puck inside a tin that hadn't been sealed right. Nothing fresh, no eggs, no meat, no herbs. This wasn't a kitchen. It was a monument to forgetting. Leora didn't sigh. She didn't despair. She just set her heavy satchel down on the floor, rolled up the sleeves of her plain dress, and got to work. Her movements were precise, efficient, born of a life that had taught her resilience. The pump out back groaned and sputtered, but it still worked. The water that came out was icy and heavy with minerals, biting at her knuckles as she filled the kettle. She didn't hum. She didn't whistle. She scrubbed the stove, the counter, the pot, the basin. She swept the corners where dust and dead insects had gathered like bitter, forgotten memories. But her movements had a rhythm, a silent language of purpose that the house hadn't felt in years. When the fire in the stove finally caught, the small, sharp crackle of the kindling was the first living noise that Kitchen had heard in what felt like a lifetime. It was a start. By the time the sun bled out behind the western ridge, she had performed a small miracle, a simple lentil stew coaxed to life with dried carrots, warm cornbread made from scratch, and coffee, black and bitter enough to wake a corpse. She set the table with 2 mismatched plates and 2 different forks, and then she sat down at the end of the table, facing the stairs, and waited. He appeared like a shadow, pulled from the darkness by the unfamiliar scent of food. Silas. His shirt was clean but hopelessly wrinkled. He smelled faintly of horsehide and the lingering smoke from the fire. He didn't sit down right away. He just stood in the doorway, his hollow eyes moving from the steaming stew to her, then to the empty chair. "You cooked all this?" he asked, his voice a rusty hinge. "Yes," she answered simply. He gave a single jerky nod, then sat. He lifted his spoon. He didn't compliment the food. He didn't comment on it. He just ate, his movements slow and mechanical. So did she. The meal passed in an unnerving silence, broken only by the clink of metal against ceramic. But something was different. An unspoken question hung in the air between them. an almost thank you that neither of them was willing to voice. Afterward, as she cleared the plates, Silas stepped out onto the porch with a pipe he didn't light. Leora brought him a cup of the black coffee. He took it with a nod, his gaze fixed on the last sliver of dying light over the ridge. "You from the east?" he asked suddenly. "Yes." He paused, the unlit pipe clenched between his teeth. "Running from something?" Leora's eyes drifted past him, out to the pasture. A single weather-beaten tree stood there, leaning sideways as if exhausted by years of fighting the wind. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was running towards something. I just didn't know what it was until I got here." He didn't ask any more questions. She didn't offer any more answers. That night, she washed in a basin of cold water in her small room tucked beneath the stairs. The bed was surprisingly soft, the quilt smelling faintly of cedar. She lay there, listening to the groans of the old house. But sometime before dawn, she heard a new sound. A soft, rhythmic creak from the floorboards directly above her. Not Silas's heavy tread. Something lighter, slower, like someone was pacing in a room that was supposed to be empty. The morning began in silence. Stove, fire, coffee, routine. But as she moved through the hallway looking for the laundry room, her eyes were drawn to a narrow, shuttered door she hadn't noticed before. She tested the handle. It was unlocked. The steps inside groaned as she climbed, each sound an intrusion, a violation of the house's silent grief. The upstairs hallway was dark. The curtains were drawn so tightly they might as well have been stitched shut. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light piercing the gloom. She opened the first door on her left. The room inside was a shrine, a child's bed, the sheets folded with perfect, heartbreaking care. A single toy soldier, lying on its side on the floor, as if it had fallen in a silent, forgotten battle. On the windowsill sat a small wooden horse carved from cedar, its mane chipped at the edge. Dust hung in the air like sleeping ghosts. She stepped forward, her heart aching. She didn't touch anything. She just looked. And then she saw it. A name, stitched into the corner of the pillowcase in the uneven, looping script of a child just learning to write. Tommy. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around. Silas was standing in the doorway, his face a blank mask, but his eyes were sharp as shards of winter ice. "I don't recall giving you permission to come up here," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I was looking for the washroom." His gaze slid past her, to the toy horse, to the neatly made bed, to the name on the pillow. "This is not for you to look at." "No," she agreed softly. "It isn't." They stood there for a long, breathless moment, the ghost of his son's memory hanging between them. "I'll finish my work downstairs," she said, stepping past him, careful not to brush against him. "I won't come up here again." He didn't respond. He just turned his back, a silent dismissal. That night at dinner, the silence was heavier than ever, but Leora broke it. "Was he your only child?" she asked, not looking up from her plate. Silas's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly back to his bowl. "Yes." She nodded. Then she did something brave. "He had good taste in toys," she said, her voice gentle. "That wooden horse, it's beautifully carved." Silas's gaze lifted from his plate. For the briefest of moments, the mask slipped. A flicker of memory, of love, of unbearable loss danced across his face before it vanished like smoke. "He liked horses," he murmured, his voice thick. Leora didn't press. She just passed him the butter. Later that night, as she washed the dishes, she heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps overhead. Not pacing this time. Just a few soft steps. Someone had walked into the room she had disturbed. Someone had moved the toy horse from the windowsill. Someone upstairs had just opened a door that had been closed for far too long. And just as she registered the sound, another fainter one reached her ears. From outside. A horse, moving at a slow walk along the ridge road, its rider just a silhouette against the moon, watching the house. The storm came on fast. One moment, the sky was a placid blue canvas. The next, thick, bruised-looking clouds came tumbling over the hills like a herd of stampeding bison, swallowing the sun whole. The air grew heavy, electric, charged with a tension that mirrored the one inside the house. Leora stood at the kitchen sink, her hands deep in cloudy dishwater, when the first crack of distant thunder split the sky. The whole house seemed to flinch. Hank burst in from the barn, shaking his hat free of dust and wind. "Storm's gonna hit hard by supper," he announced, his eyes on the darkening clouds. "We got most of the herd in, but the east gate's still loose. Boss is out there now, trying to mend the fence before it tears clean off." "Do you want me to pack him some food?" Leora asked, already drying her hands on her apron. "Please," Hank said, his gratitude plain. He watched as she quickly wrapped fresh biscuits and a slab of salt pork in a clean cloth, adding a small tin of coffee grounds. As she handed it to him, he paused, looking at her for a moment longer than usual. "The house feels warmer lately," he said, almost shyly. "Didn't think that would ever happen again." Leora offered a small, faint smile. "I didn't bring fire," she said. "Just matches." After Hank left, the wind began to howl. Leora walked through the sitting room, the one Silas never entered, the one filled with furniture shrouded in white cloths like ghosts. She cracked open a window, just a sliver, letting in the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush and the electric tang of approaching rain. It smelled like something wild and powerful waking up. And that's when she heard it. Laughter. It was soft, high-pitched, and fleeting. A child's giggle, seeming to ride on the back of the wind. She froze, her blood turning to ice. She spun around, her eyes scanning the empty, ghost-draped room. Nothing. The house was still. The only sound was the rising moan of the wind. Had she imagined it? She walked slowly back into the hallway, her heart thudding against her ribs. She stopped at the bottom of the narrow staircase leading to the second floor. The door to Tommy's room was closed. She knew she shouldn't. She knew Silas had forbidden it. But her hand lifted, hovering over the cool brass knob. Before she could decide, thunder cracked again, this time directly overhead, a deafening explosion of sound. The doorknob rattled violently under her fingertips, as if moved by the vibration or by some unseen hand. She snatched her hand back as if burned and fled back to the safety of the kitchen. The rain began to fall, tapping against the roof in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. She stirred the evening stew, her mind reeling. She'd been at the ranch for nearly 2 weeks. Long enough to know that Silas wasn't just grieving, he was trapped. Long enough to know that Hank carried a loneliness as vast as the Montana sky. And long enough to realize that she wasn't just surviving here anymore. Something inside her, some small, battered piece of her own broken heart, was starting to settle, to heal. The back door slammed open with a crash that made her jump. Silas stumbled in, soaked to the bone, his coat dripping, his boots trailing mud and grass across her clean floor. He was holding his left arm tight against his body, his jaw clenched in pain. "I told Hank to leave that damned gate," he grunted through gritted teeth. "You're bleeding," Leora said, already moving towards him. "It's fine." "It's not," she insisted, gently but firmly guiding him to a chair by the warm stove. She pulled a clean rag from a drawer. His sleeve was torn open at the bicep, and blood was darkening the fabric in an alarming way. "Barbed wire?" she asked. "Gatepost snapped back," he muttered, his face pale. She worked quickly, her movements sure and steady. She fetched the basin, filled it with warm water, and grabbed her sewing kit. As she cleaned the ugly gash, Silas winced, but didn't pull away. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, the muscle beneath still strong and solid. He stared at the floor, at the wall, anywhere but at her. "You should let me stitch this," she said softly. "I don't need—" "You do," she interrupted. He fell quiet. After a long moment, He gave a single, curt nod. She worked with a gentle efficiency, her needle moving in clean, precise loops. When she finished, she tied off the thread and began wiping the grime from his jaw with a damp cloth. "Are you always this stubborn?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flickered up to meet hers. "Only when there's someone around to notice," he murmured. For a split second, their gazes locked, and in that moment, the storm outside and the storm inside the house seemed to hold their breath. She saw not just a broken man, but the man he used to be. And he saw, what did he see? Not just a cook, not just a stranger. Someone who wasn't afraid of his silence. She stepped back, breaking the spell. "Dinner's almost ready." Silas stood up slowly, flexing the fingers of his good hand. "Thanks," he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. That night, they ate side by side at the kitchen table, not at opposite ends. A small shift, but it felt monumental. Halfway through the meal, Silas set his spoon down. The rain had softened to a gentle hush against the windows. "Did I ever tell you what happened to Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice low. "No," Leora said, her heart clenching. "Died 5 winters ago," he said, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "Fever. It was fast. Took our boy with her. He was only 5. He swallowed hard. "Tommy." Leora waited, her own grief a tight knot in her chest. "I buried them both myself," he continued, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Under the big cottonwood out back. After that, I locked the doors. All of them. Thought if I could just shut out the world, I could shut out the memories." "Did it work?" she whispered. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "No." The silence that followed wasn't heavy or awkward. It was honest, stripped bare. "I used to think," he said after a moment, "if I just stayed still enough, everything would stop hurting." "It doesn't," Leora whispered, the words tasting like her own past. "No," he agreed, his voice cracking. "But maybe it gets quieter." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. "She liked lilacs," he said suddenly. "Elizabeth tried to plant them every year right by the porch. They never took root. The soil's no good for them here." "Maybe she just chose the wrong spot," Leora said softly. He considered that. "Maybe." He stood to leave, then paused in the doorway. "You were right to go into Tommy's room," he said, not turning around. "It wasn't your place, but you were still right. He deserves to be remembered." He finally turned to face her, his eyes clear for the first time. "So do you." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the dark hallway. Later that night, Leora stood at her small window, staring out at the cottonwood tree, a dark silhouette against the moonlit fields. She whispered a single name into the glass. "Elizabeth." And for a moment, just a moment, she thought she heard the wind whisper back, "Sister." The house was changing. By mid-morning, the scent of cinnamon and baking bread, smells the house hadn't known in 5 years, drifted through the open windows. Leora had found an old recipe book tucked away in a kitchen drawer, its pages filled with Elizabeth's elegant handwriting. On one page, a recipe for cinnamon biscuits, there was a faint smudge of flour and a child's crayon scribble in the corner with a note, "More sugar next time. Tea." Leora had smiled, a real genuine smile, and set to work. The biscuits came out golden and warm. The stew simmered with wild herbs she'd found near the garden wall. The windows were cracked open, and for the first time, the Barrett Ranch felt less like a tomb and more like a home that was slowly, tentatively, waking up. Silas came in from the fields just after noon, dust on his boots, sweat on his brow. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes closing as he inhaled. "Smells like them," he said, his voice thick with a memory he hadn't let himself feel in years. "It's from Elizabeth's recipe book," Leora said quietly. "I found it in the ledger. I thought I'd try it." He nodded slowly. She always liked cinnamon with her stew. said it reminded her of her mother's house back in Virginia. He looked at Leora then, a new understanding in his eyes. He knew she wasn't just a cook. She was a keeper of memories. They ate on the porch steps, the sun warm on their faces. The cottonwood tree swayed in the gentle breeze, its leaves whispering secrets to the two graves tucked beneath it. "Do you believe in second chances?" Silas asked after a long, comfortable silence, his gaze fixed on the pasture. Leora took a breath. "I believe we don't get to choose how the first ones end," she said, "but we get to choose what we do after." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the guard he'd held up for so long finally seemed to crumble, worn down not by force, but by simple kindness. "I was angry for so long," he admitted, his voice rough. "At the fever, at God, at myself. I kept thinking if I just kept the curtains drawn, the rest of the world would stop turning without them." "And did it?" she asked softly. He gave a short, sad laugh. "No. Turns out grief doesn't care if you hide from it, and the world doesn't care if you fall behind." He looked at her. "You're not what I expected, Leora Hensley. Neither are you, Silas Barrett." They sat in that peaceful silence for a while longer, a fragile truce with the ghosts of the past. But peace is a fragile thing in a place like Bitter Creek. Later that evening, as Leora was setting the table for dinner, the sound of a horse galloping hard broke the quiet. Hank rode into the yard, his face pale and drawn tight, his horse lathered in sweat. He didn't even dismount. Silas met him by the gate. "What is it?" "Trouble," Hank said, his voice low and urgent. "Big trouble. Frank Harlan is back in town." The name landed like a physical blow. Silas stiffened, his entire body going rigid. "What does he want?" "Not sure yet," Hank said. "But he's been buying drinks at the saloon, talking loud, asking about the ranch, about who owns it now. He even had a long meeting with the new land assessor. Said something about unfinished business." Silas's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle jumped in his cheek. From the porch, Leora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Who's Frank Harlan?" she asked, as Silas walked back up the steps, his face a thundercloud. Silas stared out at the horizon, his eyes dark. "He was engaged to Elizabeth, before me." Leora's breath caught in her throat. "It was a family arrangement," Silas continued, his voice cold as steel. "A social match. She didn't love him. She broke it off 6 months before the wedding and married me instead." "And he didn't take that well, I assume," Leora said, her own past rushing back at her. "No." Silas's voice was laced with a darkness she hadn't heard before. "He left town, went off to the war, came back with a medal on his chest, a scar on his cheek, and a grudge the size of this valley, a grudge he never buried. But why come back now, after all this time?" Silas finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim understanding. "Because he knows I'm alone. He knows I'm broken. And because this land, with the railroad coming through, is worth more now than it ever has been." A terrifying thought began to form in Leora's mind. "The land," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it legally in your name?" Silas's face went pale. "It was in Tommy's, a legal trust. I was the trustee, but when Tommy died, I didn't file the succession papers. I couldn't bear it. I didn't see the point." Leora's heart plummeted. "That means, legally, it's vulnerable," Silas said, the words tasting like ash. "If Frank plays this right, he could argue the trust expired. He could argue the land is unclaimed property. And he could try to seize it," Leora finished, the full, horrifying scope of Frank Harlan's plan crashing down on her. "He won't get far," Hank muttered from the gate. "This land remembers who it belongs to." But Silas didn't look so sure. His eyes had gone hard and cold. That night, after a tense, silent supper, Silas retrieved a dusty, locked trunk from the attic. He set it on the sitting room floor, a cloud of dust and memories rising as he turned the key. Inside were papers, old deeds, Tommy's birth certificate, and Elizabeth's will. And in the bottom corner, there was a sealed envelope. On it, in Elizabeth's familiar looping script, were the words, "To my Silas. Open only if the shadow returns." Silas stared at it, his hands trembling. "She always thought ahead," he whispered. He didn't open it right away. He just held it, as if it might burst into flames. She was smarter than I ever gave her credit for. "You're not the only one learning how to grieve," Leora said softly. The fire in the hearth crackled, a lonely sound in the tense quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moaning around the corners of the house, and far off, in the direction of town, a single lantern flickered on the ridge road, a watcher in the dark. Frank Harlan had come home. And he wasn't just here to reopen old wounds. He was here to claim the land, the house, and to erase every last memory of the family who had dared to stand in his way. The letter smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar, the scent of Elizabeth. Silas sat at the kitchen table long after the house had grown cold, the envelope open before him, his late wife's words a ghostly dance across the page. Leora sat opposite him, a silent sentinel, watching as the weight of the past and the threat of the future settled on his shoulders. He read the letter twice, his lips moving silently, before he finally spoke. "She knew," he whispered, his voice full of awe and sorrow. "She knew he'd come back. Not if. When." "What does it say, Silas?" Leora asked gently. He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Before she passed, she wrote to the county clerk in Red Meadow, secretly. She had a clause added to Tommy's trust. It states that if the land is ever contested while I'm still living here, the property automatically defaults to my name as guardian survivor. He shook his head in disbelief. She was protecting us, even then. "That's brilliant," Leora breathed. "She always was," Silas murmured, folding the precious paper with reverent care. "But there's a catch. This was never filed publicly. She didn't want to draw attention to it. She wrote that she feared Frank would find a way to challenge it, to undo it, if he ever knew it existed." "Then we need the original copy," Leora said, her mind racing. "The one in the clerk's office." "I'll ride to town first thing," Silas said, a new resolve hardening his voice. But town came to them first. The next morning, just as the sun was painting the eastern sky, the thunder of hooves echoed across the field. Hank spotted them from the barn, a small group of 4 riders, all dressed in formal black coats and hats, far too polished for ranch land. And at their center, sitting on a magnificent black stallion, was Frank Harlan. He rode with an air of smug, unassailable confidence. Leora watched from the porch, her apron still tied around her waist, her hands dusted with biscuit flour. Frank dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, brushing imaginary dust from his cuffs, as if the very air of the Barrett Ranch offended him. His scar, a thin white line against his tanned cheek, seemed to tighten as he smiled. "Well, Barrett," he said, his voice rich and cold as a winter stream. "Still standing, I see, for now." Silas stepped down from the porch, his hands loose at his sides, his body radiating a quiet, dangerous tension. "What do you want, Frank?" "To resolve unfinished business," Frank said with a cruel smile. "You stole my fiancée, and then you had the audacity to bury her on land that, as it turns out, doesn't even legally belong to you." He held up a set of folded documents like a winning hand in a poker game. "I filed an injunction with the county court, claiming this land under unassigned trust law. According to the official register, the title lapsed upon the unfortunate death of your son. You, my dear Silas, have been squatting here for 5 years. That makes this a contested estate." "I have evidence to refute that," Silas said, his voice steady despite the tremor of rage Leora could see in his hands. Frank tilted his head, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Do you now? Then I suggest you produce it at the hearing. Judge Kellerman will preside in 3 days. I'm sure he remembers me, and my family's many contributions to this county, quite well." With a mocking tip of his hat, Frank turned and swung himself back onto his horse. His men, silent and imposing, followed his lead. They rode away, leaving a trail of dust and dread hanging in the morning air. "He's not bluffing," Leora said, stepping beside Silas. "No," Silas replied, his voice a low growl. "He's planning to win." That afternoon, Silas and Hank set off on the 2-day ride to Red Meadow, the county seat. Leora stood in the doorway, watching them disappear over the ridge, her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't good at waiting. She was a woman of action, and the forced stillness was a torment. That night, the house felt larger, emptier, more vulnerable than ever. She walked past the closed door to Tommy's room and paused. This time she didn't hesitate. She opened the door and stepped inside, not as an intruder, but as a guardian. She dusted the shelves. She straightened the quilt. She placed the little wooden horse upright on the windowsill, its chipped mane pointing toward the horizon like a lonely sentinel. Then she knelt beside the small wooden chest in the corner, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst folded shirts and broken crayons, was a small cloth pouch. She hadn't noticed it before. She opened it. Inside was a single perfectly preserved dried flower, tied with a bit of twine. A lilac, and beside it, a tiny silver pin, the kind given to children for bravery at Sunday school. She pressed the small treasures to her chest, a fierce, protective fire igniting in her heart. "I will not let him take this from you," she whispered to the ghost of the boy she'd never met. "Not again. Not ever." 2 nights later, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the shutters and shaking the very bones of the house. Leora was jolted from a restless sleep by a frantic knocking. Not at the door, at her window. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and crept to the front door. When she pulled it open, Hank stood there, drenched and gasping for breath, his eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and terror. "Silas sent me ahead," he panted, stumbling inside. "He's riding hard. He found it, Leora. The letter. The clerk had it. The amendment is real. It's all verified, signed, witnessed. It's real." Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. They had it. They had the proof. But Hank's expression remained grim. "There's more," he said, his voice dropping to a fearful whisper. "Frank knows. Somehow, he found out we were there. He's planning something. I heard his men talking in Red Meadow. He's not going to let this get to a hearing." "What kind of fight?" Leora asked, her blood running cold. Hank looked past her, out into the stormy darkness. "The kind that burns things to the ground." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ranch in a flash of stark, terrifying white. And in that moment, Leora knew. This was no longer about land or law. It was about erasure. Frank Harlan wasn't just trying to take the ranch. He was trying to burn away every last trace that Silas, Elizabeth, and Tommy had ever existed. The night was a torment of howling wind and rattling windows. Leora didn't sleep. She sat in a chair by the hearth, the shotgun across her lap, listening. Listening for the sound of hoofbeats that didn't belong, for the crackle of timber too close to the house. Dawn arrived not with birdsong, but with the bitter, acrid smell of smoke. She was on the porch in an instant, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The sky to the east, usually a soft pink, was stained with a plume of ugly, greasy gray. Hank rode out hard, his face a mask of grim determination, to meet Silas on the road from Red Meadow. Leora remained behind, a lone guardian, her eyes scanning the horizon, every creak of the old windmill sending a jolt of adrenaline through her. By mid-morning, a lone rider approached. It was the sheriff, Marshal Amos Dyer, a man built like a stone wall, broad, silent, and weathered by time. He dismounted without ceremony and tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Silas is on his way back from Red Meadow," she answered, her grip tightening on the shotgun. What's this about, Marshal? Dyer sighed, a sound of pure weariness. Frank Harlan filed a formal complaint, accuses Silas of occupying this property illegally. He paused, and then delivered the killing blow, and of tampering with court records. Claims that amendment you all found is a forgery. That's a lie, Leora exclaimed, her voice shaking with rage. I don't doubt it for a second, Dyer said, his eyes filled with a tired sympathy. But it's a clever lie. It's enough for a temporary injunction until the hearing. The judge won't just toss it out without a full review. It's Frank's word against yours. So what does that mean for us? She asked, a cold dread seeping into her bones. Dyer looked uncomfortable. It means until the hearing in 2 days this land is in limbo. No filing paperwork, no official changes. And it means Silas has to show up in person to contest it. He looked her straight in the eye. Frank's been stirring folks up, spreading poison in town. He's got a few ranchers on his side, promising them a piece of the pie if he takes ownership. He's buying loyalty with lies, she spat. Dyer shrugged, a gesture of grim resignation. Some folks'll sell their souls if the price is right. As he mounted his horse, he looked back at her. Tell Silas to watch his back. Frank Harlan doesn't just play dirty. This time, he's organized. The dust from the marshal's horse had barely settled when the faint thunder of another rider rolled in from the south. It was Silas. He looked weary to the bone, but his eyes burned with a feverish light. Leora met him on the porch. He knows, she said without preamble. He filed a block, called the amendment a forgery. I figured he would, Silas replied, swinging down from his horse. He held up a leather satchel. But this is real. Signed, sealed, witnessed. It'll hold up in court. If we can make it to court, Leora said grimly. An hour later, Hank returned, his face pale and pinched. I rode past the Beasley place on my way back, he said, his voice strained. Their barn's gone, burned clean to the ground. Silas stiffened. Arson? Had to be, Hank said. And the Beasleys? They were the only ones who testified against Frank in that cattle-rustling case last spring. A coincidence, I'm sure, Silas muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He's not just trying to intimidate us, Leora said, her mind working furiously. She moved to the table, spreading out their precious documents, the certified amendment, Elizabeth's letter. He's eliminating witnesses. He's trying to scare anyone who might speak up for you. We ride for the courthouse at first light, Silas declared, his jaw set like granite. But morning came with fire. The smell hit them first, thick and choking, slithering through the open window like a venomous snake. Hank burst through the front door, his face wild with panic. The North Fields! They're burning! Silas was already moving, grabbing his boots, his hat, the old shovel by the door. They rode out hard, the rising sun obscured by a curtain of black smoke. The flames were a living nightmare, a roaring, crackling wall of orange and yellow licking at the dry grass, devouring years of hard work in seconds. Silas and Hank dismounted and ran toward the blaze, beating at the edges with shovels and sacks, their faces streaked with soot, their lungs burning. Leora stayed on her horse, circling wide, herding the terrified cattle away from the inferno. The heat was immense, the smoke blinding, but she kept going, her mind a cold, clear point of focus. This wasn't random. The fire was deliberate, a distraction. As the thought hit her, she saw it. Through a gap in the smoke, 2 riders on the far ridge, watching the chaos. They were too far away to identify, but she knew. They were Harlan's men, and they weren't just watching the fire. They were watching the house. A sudden, terrifying realization crashed down on her. The fire wasn't the main attack. It was a diversion. They wanted them all out here, fighting the blaze, while the house was left undefended. Silas! She screamed, her voice raw. It's a trick! They're after the house! They're after the papers! Silas's head snapped up. His eyes met hers across the fiery field, and in that instant, he understood. He dropped his shovel and sprinted for his horse,
a desperate, primal fear on his face. He wasn't just afraid of losing his land. He was afraid of losing the last tangible piece of his wife's legacy. They galloped back towards the ranch, the roar of the fire at their backs, a new, more terrible fear propelling them forward. As they cleared the rise, Leora's heart stopped. The front door of the house was wide open, swinging gently in the smoky breeze. They were too late. The courthouse in Bitter Creek was packed. Every rancher, townsfolk, and drifter for 50 miles had crammed into the sweltering room, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and nervous tension. They were here for the spectacle, to watch a man fight for his home, or to see him lose everything.
Silas stood tall, his oldest coat on his back, the one Elizabeth had patched at the elbows years ago. He wasn't dressed to impress. He was dressed to remember. Beside him, Leora was a pillar of quiet strength, her chin held high, her gaze steady. Hank stood behind them, his hand resting on the leather satchel at his feet. But the satchel felt horrifyingly light. Frank Harlan sat at the plaintiff's table, looking cool and composed in a suit too fine for this dusty town. His lawyer, a slick city man named Reed Castwell, adjusted his spectacles, a smug smile playing on his lips. They thought they had already won. Because when Silas and Leora had burst back into the ransacked house, the precious certified amendment from Red Meadow was gone. The most crucial piece of their defense had been stolen. Judge Kellerman, an old man with tired eyes and a reputation for hating liars, banged his gavel. "This court will come to order. We are here to hear the petition to transfer ownership of the Barrett Ranch, filed by Mr. Frank Harlan." Castwell rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the matter is simple. The trust holding the Barrett Ranch expired upon the death of the beneficiary, Tommy Barrett. No succession was filed. The land, by law, reverts to the county to be auctioned. My client has made a generous offer." "You're suggesting," the judge grumbled, "that the father of the deceased has no claim to his own home?" "I'm suggesting, Your Honor," Castwell purred, "that a motion does not transfer property, deeds do. And Mr. Barrett has no deed." The judge turned to Silas. "Mr. Barrett, your response?" Silas stood, his face grim. "Your Honor, my late wife, Elizabeth, created an amendment to the trust. It assigns survivorship rights to me. It was witnessed and notarized." "And where is this amendment?" Castwell interjected. "We have seen no such document filed with the court." "It was stolen from my home yesterday morning, during a fire that was deliberately set on my property," Silas said, his voice ringing with conviction. A murmur went through the courtroom. Castwell scoffed. "An outlandish accusation. Your Honor, Mr. Barrett has no proof of this document, nor of this convenient fire. He has only fairy tales." The judge looked at Silas, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Barrett, without the document, I have nothing to go on." It was over. Leora could feel the hope draining from the room. Frank Harlan leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smirk on his face. Then Leora stood up. "Permission to speak, Your Honor?" All eyes turned to her. "And you are?" the judge asked. "Leora Hensley, Your Honor, an employee at the Barrett Ranch." She took a deep breath. "The amendment was real. I saw it. It was certified by the clerk in Red Meadow." "Hearsay, Your Honor," Castwell said dismissively. "The word of a hired girl." "It may be hearsay," Leora said, her voice clear and strong, "but it is not the only evidence we have of Frank Harlan's deception." She turned, her eyes locking with Frank's, the color drained from his face. "You see, Elizabeth Barrett didn't just write a legal document. She was smarter than that. She knew who she was dealing with. She also kept a journal." Frank shot to his feet. "This is irrelevant. A woman's private diary has no place in this court." "It does," Leora said, her voice dropping. "When it details the tonics and herbal remedies you brought to her and her son during their final illness. It does when it describes how they both grew weaker and sicker every time you visited." The courtroom fell into a stunned, horrified silence. "And it becomes very relevant," Leora continued, pulling a small folded paper from the pocket of her dress, "when it leads you to a confession. A confession from the town doctor, admitting he was blackmailed by you, Frank, into administering a slow-acting poison disguised as medicine for a fever. She held up the paper. Elizabeth was afraid something like this might happen. She convinced the doctor to write and sign this, and she hid it. She hid it with the only thing she loved as much as her son. Leora's eyes filled with tears. She hid it inside Tommy's little wooden horse. The courtroom erupted. Frank Harlan lunged across the table, his face a mask of pure rage, his eyes wild. But he wasn't lunging for Silas. He was lunging for her. "You!" he screamed, his voice a strangled cry of disbelief. "It's you! You're her sister! Elizabeth's little sister! I should have known!" The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The marshal grabbed Frank, restraining him as he struggled and cursed. The whole room was staring at Leora, who stood tall, the tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with grief and triumph. "My name is Leora, and I came here to find justice for my sister." The gavel slammed down, but no one heard it over the roar of the crowd. The land was safe. The truth was out. Frank Harlan hadn't just lost a ranch. He had been exposed as a monster, his legacy turning to ash right before his eyes. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, and for the first time in 5 years, it felt like the light had truly returned to Bitter Creek. The days that followed were quiet, like the land itself was breathing a long, slow sigh of relief. The scorched patches in the north field began to show the faintest hints of green, life stubbornly pushing its way up through the ash. The town, once so cold and hostile, seemed to open up. People would nod to Silas on the street. Mrs. Haywood from the general store pressed a jar of her finest preserves into Leora's hands, her eyes full of apology. The curse on the Barrett Ranch had been broken. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, not with the frantic energy of a man running from his ghosts, but with the steady, purposeful rhythm of a man rebuilding his life. He mended fences. He repaired the barn roof. He worked alongside Hank, and sometimes Leora would hear the faint, rusty sound of his laughter carrying on the breeze. Leora planted things. She found wild lilac cuttings down by the creek and carefully planted them by the porch, in the very spot where Elizabeth's had always failed to grow. She filled the windowsills with pots of rosemary and wild mint, and the house began to smell of earth and herbs and hope. One evening, Silas found her on the porch, her hands covered in soil, a small, contented smile on her face. "I want you to stay," he said, the words coming out clumsy and rough, but honest. "Not because I need a cook, because this house needs you. I need you." Leora looked up at him, at this man who had been resurrected from a tomb of grief, and her own heart felt full to bursting. "I'll stay," she said. It was the simplest promise, but it held the weight of a lifetime. A few weeks later, Silas brought another trunk down from the attic. This one wasn't filled with legal papers, but with memories, old photographs, Tommy's crayon drawings, Elizabeth's favorite shawl. Together, they carefully dusted off the frames and hung the pictures on the wall, filling the empty spaces with faces and smiles. They were building a new life, not on top of the old one, but alongside it, weaving the past and the present together. One afternoon, they walked hand in hand to the top of the ridge, looking down at the ranch nestled in the valley below. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the new lilac bushes on the porch seemed to glow in the warm light. "Hank told me Frank Harlan was sentenced last week," Silas said quietly. "He'll spend the rest of his life in prison." Leora nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Justice," she whispered. "No," Silas said, turning to look at her, his eyes clear and full of a love she never thought she'd find. "This is justice." He gestured to the house, to the fields, to the life they were building. Starting over, remembering, living. They stood there for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen, two broken people who had found a way to heal each other. They had faced down ghosts and monsters, fire and lies, and they had won.
They had discovered that the strongest foundations aren't built on land or law, but on love, courage, and the stubborn refusal to let the darkness have the final word. The wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, carrying the scent of lilacs, a promise that even in the harshest soil, love could find a way to grow back. If you enjoyed this story and believe that truth will always find its way to the light, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next story we have for you.